Okay, let's pray. God, we thank you for who you are. In the midst of all seasons, remind us of who you are, God. May your love be stronger than our disbelief, God. Soften our hearts today. Talk to us and give us, stir something up in our hearts. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. All right, my group of friends in Vancouver are a bunch of guys, okay? So there's some weird alpha male competition thing always going on. We're always competing somehow. And years ago, we were at Cultus Lake, and so obviously needed a competition, and we're like, yo, let's see who can swim out to that buoy over there and back the fastest. And then bam, we're in the water, okay, we're swimming. One of my close friends, Vincent, and I were the fastest swimmers by far. And so we're head to head the whole time. And then all of a sudden, I pull forward, and I pull forward for a long time, actually. And then, which is weird, because Vincent's like a try-hard, okay? And so I turn around. I don't see Vincent anymore. A few seconds of scanning around, I see splashing a few meters away. And I realized Vincent is drowning, okay? So for the next, what felt like 10 minutes, probably was like 20 seconds, I do whatever I can to be a foundation for him to stay afloat. So he's pushing, he's pulling, all of that, and although I'm buoyant, right, I'm not a very good foundation, right? He's still half drowning. Other people join, eventually a floaty comes, and then he's safe. Okay, turns out his leg was cramping. Now, Jess knows this, but I like to make weird jokes and to get reactions out of people. So recently I told him, Vincent, my favorite summer was the one where you almost drowned. And he's all like butthurt, and he's like, oh, how could you say that? Why'd you say that? And I'm like, because you got closer to God, and then, I don't know. Is that funny? No, that's not funny. No, he wasn't laughing either, okay? But I share this story because in life, we have all been Vincent, okay? Metaphorically, a sense of drowning in dark waters, suffering, desperately reaching for anything, any foundation to stay afloat, and oftentimes, we find nothing stable, and we drown. There's an epidemic that kills about more than 700,000 people a year, so that's about half the population of Calgary, especially for those my age and younger. Do you know what it is? It's not COVID, it's suicide, okay? Now, simply losing a loved one to an accident or something is already a tragic, but suicide is a whole different level of that. To get to a place where in your suffering, you decide for yourself that to die is better than to live with everything that you've ever known, that's beyond a tragedy, right? And it's always pretty much a surprise to all their loved ones. What does that mean? That means that as they're suffering with this I'd rather die level of hurt, their suffering is secret, it's invisible, no one knows about it. The one suffering probably has no idea what to do about it. Now, the biggest mystery for me regarding suffering of any kind is how is it that some people go through their worst seasons of life and they come out of it radiant, okay? Full of life and joy, deeply depending on God. We can like laugh and make jokes and say, because you got closer to God. And then other people come out of it, if not dead, walking around as if they were dead, jaded, bitter, untrusting, alone. Right? How do we become the first group? What do they know that we don't? Let's explore that today. Okay, we're starting a new series on one of the best literatures on suffering. It's an ancient epic collection of poems called the Book of Job. And now the way Job is written is that major themes are drawn out and weaved throughout the whole book, and all its conclusions are at the end. Okay, so because of that, we're not going to go chronologically, or else we'll have 5 sermons with no answers and 1 sermon with 5 answers. We're going by themes. And since this is the case, I'm starting all the way at Job 38, okay, which means you have to summarize the previous 37 chapters. But it's good, okay? Let's do it. Our epic story starts off with, in the land of Uz, aka in a land far, far away, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. So we're introduced to the most holy, righteous man, godly man imaginable, and it goes on to describe him as the richest man imaginable as well. So everything you could want, family, riches, status, he has it all. He's him, okay? Then all of a sudden, we're zoomed up into heaven. Or we're having God is having a staff meeting with his angels. Remember, this is epic, poetic literature, okay? And in comes a being called the accuser, or the opposer, or the Satan. We just call him Satan. And as God is praising Job for being super godly, Satan makes a wager and says, Job is only faithful to God because God has been blessing him so much. Essentially, Job loves the things of God, not God himself. And then God hears it, and he accepts the wager to prove him wrong, God gives Satan permission to take everything away from Job, and Job loses everything. His children, his servants, his riches, even his health eventually. Strangely, Satan did not touch his wife at all. I'm not sure why, but you can kind of imagine another demon saying to Satan, hey, you forgot to kill Job's wife, and then Satan's like, no, leave her, don't touch her. That's part of the suffering, right? I'm kidding, guys, come on, okay. But she actually turns out pretty bad. But Job is broken, okay? And he curses the day he was born multiple times. In his suffering, Job's friends come to comfort him, but then they start accusing him and start making all these theories about what's happening. They're like, if God is just, which he is, then he must run the world off a principle of justice. And since Job is suffering so much, he must have done something super wrong to deserve it. And Job is like trying to defend his innocence, but they won't believe him. And he's like so confused, he doesn't know what's going on. But for us readers, okay, we know that Job is innocent. He's like super godly. And so in his suffering, Job is asking hundreds of questions towards God, but ultimately, he is asking God to come, show up, explain why this is happening, and prove that he's innocent, because this whole time God is absent. And finally, God shows up, and this is where our passage starts. 38:1. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, who is this that obscures my plans without words of knowledge? Or in other words, who's criticizing what I'm doing without even knowing anything? Brace yourself like a man, I will question you. You'll stop questioning me, I'll question you, and you shall answer me. And then God proceeds to ask him like 70 questions, you can read it yourself, that Job has no way of answering. So everything from, Job, where were you? Were you around when I shaped the earth and laid its foundations? What were you doing when I put the cosmos and galaxies together? Or there's some like really weird ones too, like, do you know how mountain goats give birth, right? Or why ostriches are like so ugly and handicapped? Actually, Job 39:13, look it up. And God's response just sounds so random and actually, if we're being honest, useless. All right? Just imagine you coming to God out of your deepest suffering, knowing you don't deserve this, and then he responds with well, can you make a hippopotamus? I'd be so freaking angry. Right? And while it seems there's no way we can learn anything from God's response, he actually gives us 3 truths that we need to know in order to suffer in a way where we don't simply survive it half dead, but we come out of it stronger, more faithful, more dependent on God, more full of life. And that's our focus today. Why are ostriches so ugly? Okay, question is, what truths do we need to hold in order to suffer positively? 1, God's presence is in the suffering. 2, God's perspective gives hope to the suffering. 3, God's purpose redeems the suffering. Each of these lead into the next. Well, I guess they can be standalone too, but let's just start with the first one, okay? Now, I know we didn't go through any of the whole story, but let's just look at quick snippets of Job's speech. And as you're reading this, ask yourself, what is the spirit of it? What is Job asking for? Okay, so next slide. Okay. Let me know, why you are fighting me? Does it delight you to oppress and despise what you have made while you smile at the plans of the wicked? I want to talk to the Almighty. I'm determined to argue my case before God. My eyes overflow with tears to God, crying for him to arbitrate between this man, Job, and God, as a human does with his fellow neighbor, so face to face. I wish I could go back to how things were a few months ago when God used to watch over me. The Almighty was still with me back then. Who will grant me a hearing? Here's my signature. Let the Almighty answer. What is Job asking for? Yes, he's asking for answers. Yes, he's asking to prove his innocence. But above all, I believe he's asking for God to show up, because in all of this, it legit feels like he has been abandoned. God has left the chat. He's AFK. He's absent. He's forgotten Job. And so Job is asking, please show up. And God actually shows up. And in a sense, that is enough for Job. In the final chapter, I don't have it up here, but Job answers God, and this is the Message paraphrase of 42, 5-6. He says, I admit I once lived by rumors of you. Now I have it all firsthand, from my own eyes and ears. I'm sorry, forgive me. I'll never do that again, I promise. I'll never live on the crust of hearsay, crumbs of rumor. He's seen with his own eyes. He's heard. God has met him. See, presence is everything, even between humans. Okay? One of the biggest things Christine has taught me in marriage is that talking isn't just a way of getting ideas and opinions across. It's actually for relationship and friendship building. Okay? Talking is actually the very way we enjoy each other's souls and personalities and thoughts and whatnot. It's how we show our presence to one another in our friendship. Okay? So before, since I thought the end goal of talking was just getting stuff done, my answers to Christine was always efficient. Okay? Yes, no, maybe, I don't know, I don't care, right? Now imagine a lifetime of this kind of conversation. Is it effective at getting things done? Definitely, super effective. Is there life or presence in it? No, not at all. So if Christine asked me, okay, do you like this white on the wall or this white? Okay, even though my first thought is they look the same, I don't care, don't ask me. With friendship and presence in mind, I now answer more like, okay, honestly, they're both good whites, you can't go wrong, okay? But I'm personally leaning towards this one because it has more yellow tones and the light will reflect it in a way that makes our space warmer. And that's really good because Calgary has a lot of cold, long winters. Thank you, HGTV, okay? Now, do I believe that? I don't even know if I believe that. I think I'm starting to, but the goal isn't simply to get my preference across, it's to give Christine my presence in the relationship, all right? The opposite of that would be like the efficient, I don't care, why are you asking me, right? But how is she supposed to respond to that cold and apathetic response? Honestly, think about the two ways of talking, okay? Which would you rather have for the rest of your life? Not within marriage, but friendships and family. The one with presence, right? And so if this is the case between two humans made in God's image, how much more is this the case between us and God? For Job, I think it actually matters more that God showed up in his presence than simply getting answers. Perhaps the presence of God is the deepest level of our desires as his image bearers. It reminds me of that line in Psalm 23, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, aka the worst, loneliest, crappiest season of my life ever, I will fear no evil. And you kind of expect the next part to be because you'll pull me through, because you'll crush the evil, you'll give me what I want. No, he just writes, for you are with me, okay? And obviously that contains everything else, but as if being with God in our roughest seasons is enough. As if it is better than being in our good seasons without God. It goes on to say, you prepare a table, a feast before me in the presence of my enemies. Now think about that. The enemies are still there. They're right in front of you. The issue is not resolved. But being with God is enough to celebrate, to throw a feast, okay? It's easy to think God is only with us in the good times and not the bad. But unlike Job, we as Christians know that we have the Holy Spirit with us at all times. And Jesus himself said he'll be with us until the end of the age. We already have the very prize and goal of our existence right now. And there's a joy to be found there, right? God is present, attuned, aware, working, even in our suffering. And so that we can say, I'm hurting, but God is my comforter. I'm scared, but God is my refuge. I'm lost, but God is my home. I'm nothing, but God is my everything. Now, this truth of God's presence, right, we don't just activate it like that in our suffering, right? If anything, we have to train ourselves to see it and believe it in the good times, because if you can't see God's presence and goodness in your life when your vision is clear and bright, it'll be nearly impossible when you're in the blind darkness of suffering, okay? And so, actually, for every application point today, you can do it in the middle of suffering, but it's meant to be done in the good times. For this point of God's presence, the invitation is prayer. Prayer not just as asking for God to do things for us, even though that is biblical and good, but prayer as talking to God, right? The ones we were made for, being present to his presence. Prayer in this way is not simply a means of getting something, it's the end goal of life. It's what we hope to be doing for the rest of eternity, right? Talking and laughing and getting to know God deeper in relationship with him. What better way is there to teach yourself this vital truth of God's constant presence than to simply be in communion and conversation with him at all times? Practice prayer. Start by figuring out your own style of how you best communicate with God. Some people talk to him the most, the best when they're driving, okay? That's awesome. Some of you should never do that. You're terrible at driving. And so keep your eyes on the road. But on the other hand, maybe you should be praying. I don't know, you figure it out yourself. What works for me is I have to hide when I pray. It sounds so stupid, and I hate myself for this, but I care so much about what people think about me that if I'm in the living room praying and Christine walks down and sees me praying, all of a sudden, I don't know if this is am I doing this like between me and God, or am I trying to show Christine that I'm like holy or whatever, and so I have to hide? I know, gross, cringy, but this is me. This is what I have to struggle with for the rest of my life. What about you? What works for you? If you have no idea where to start with prayer, shoot me a message after. Shoot me a message right now, even, right? And I'll send you my favorite resources. But through the practice of prayer, when suffering hits, you've built a higher capacity to know deeply, God is still with me. I will not fear. And when we accept God is there, lovingly present in your life in all seasons, we can kind of begin to look at our second point. God's perspective gives hope to the suffering. In our passage today, when God shows up, we're totally expecting like an answer for why everything is happening, and even like an empathetic, oh man, that sucks, I'm so sorry you had to go through this, thanks for enduring. No, none of that, right? God never explains the reason for why Job suffers. Just like in our lives, we hardly ever get to know the why behind our hurts. What does God say instead? First thing God says is, who is this person that criticizes my plans without knowing anything? And then God proceeds to take Job across like a cosmic tour of the universe while asking him all these impossible questions that Job has no way of answering, right? Where were you when I created everything? Do you know how this thing works? Did you even know this thing existed? What is God doing here? God is showing, especially compared to Job, that God has a gigantic perspective of every single thing going on in the universe. In the past, in the present, in the future, in other dimensions, if that's a real thing. And he operates and controls everything, not simply by what Job knows, but by every single data point of existence and even non-existence, okay? Which is great news for us, because just because our tiny little brains can't think of a reason for bad things, for suffering, doesn't mean there isn't one. Our perspective is too small. And because of that, we're prone to making harmful assumptions, okay? Quick story that probably just speaks about how sinful and shallow I am. But in high school, we played volleyball against a school called Burnaby Central. And there's this one kid there who was like a god at volleyball, okay? Like he could single-handedly destroy a whole club team by himself, you know? And so because of that, we all worshiped him. We wanted to be him. But one day, we were visiting their school, and we went early, like really early, lunch early, and we saw him eating lunch by himself. And he wasn't in like sports clothes. He was in his normal clothes. And he dressed like a nerd. And we're all confused because like on the volleyball court, he's our God. And right now, we just kind of see like a loser, right? If you ever watched Recess growing up, it was the ultimate moment of like finding out Vincent's brother Chad was like a loser, okay? And it clicked for us. Just because you're good at volleyball doesn't mean you're automatically cool or whatnot in real life, doesn't mean you're a good person, doesn't mean anything other than you're good at volleyball. Now, I know there's so many things wrong with that whole story, and I need Jesus deeply, but here's the point, okay? Using tiny perspectives to make big assumptions about friends, partners, life, and God will hurt us, is hurting us, and it will hurt others. See, behind Job's source of suffering, it was actually an assumption about God based on his tiny perspective, right? It's a very narrow view of how God must operate. He must bless the good people. He must punish the bad people. And because Job and his friends put God in this tiny box, Job's experience and Job's assumption did not line up, and that caused him deep suffering. As one philosopher famously said, a God small enough to be understood is not big enough to be worshipped. Now, why does anyone ever put God in a box? Perhaps we want a version of God that we can explain, manage, keep, manipulate in this nice, tidy little system. We want to be God over God, right? Why? I think at the core of every human, or maybe just me, there's a voice saying, I can only trust myself. And so I have to be the one in control. So what's the application here? The invitation is to humbly trust God in his perspective and surrender to him and who he is and what he is doing. Now, trust is a weird thing. It's one of those things where when the older you get, the smarter you are, the more accomplished you get, the less you have in other people, but more you have in yourself, okay? And so it's something you actually got to train. How do we build up this trust in God before the storm hits? Don't take this out of context, but I think the secret here is to inflict self-suffering. Now, before you freak out, I'm not talking about physical self-harm. Don't cut yourself or anything. But let's just think about what suffering is. Okay, what is suffering? What is it if not simply your desires, your dreams, your expectations that you've built your life and hopes on being taken away from you? And that sucks. I know, that sucks. But within the Christian life, that's not always a bad thing. Because as you're stripped of these things that you demand to have in order to have a good, fulfilling life, the invitation from God is to reframe the way you've structured your life, to use Him as the main pillar for your life, right? To realize He's enough. Now, we can intentionally take some of these things away in the good times as a way of training ourselves to be more trusting and dependent on God. So fasting is a biblical example of this. I need God more than I need food and other fleshly desires. We can do this in all sorts of ways, okay? That impulsive desire to buy something off Amazon every time you have like a down day, okay? Stop buying things. Just let that crappy feeling you're trying to run away from hit you like a train, and then meet God there. Learn to trust Him right there, okay? If it's like me, it's not things and it's comfort food, stop going to Wendy's, even though it's so cheap and good, right? Maybe self-suffering looks like getting rid of your snooze button so that you can wake up early and spend time with God. I know you were saying, I need God more than my extra 10 or 20 minutes or 2 hours of sleep or whatever. I know to you, like night owls there, that's like probably the worst suffering ever. But these are just examples of how you can use self-denial, self-suffering to teach ourselves to surrender to and trust God. To say, God, I need you more than X, Y, Z. And when things are taken away from you beyond your control, you will have built the capacity and habit to turn to God right away and trust His bigger perspective for life. God, I have no idea why this is happening, and it friggin' hurts, but you're God. You're good. You know I need you more than these things. That's good enough for me. What can you give up to train yourself to trust God alone? Once we know God is present in our suffering, and there's a reason for our suffering, even though we don't have the perspective to see it, we reach our final truth, okay? God's purpose redeems the suffering. Okay, so we see God, taking Job on this cosmic tour, and part of that is to show, hey, you don't have a big enough perspective to criticize me, you should trust me instead. But I think another thing God is showing is how tiny Job is in the perspective of all things, okay? Deeply loved, but just one tiny system, one tiny cog in a great system. What is the implication here? Job isn't the only thing that exists in the universe, okay? And though that's obvious, in our suffering, our whole world becomes tiny, okay? We can only see the pain. Suffering makes us so self-absorbed that we don't see anything beyond us. We don't see other people hurting. We don't see people hurting with us. We don't see the beauty in the world. We don't even see God here anymore. And I think that's why God shows the rest of the universe, everything beyond Job's world. There is more than just you and what is happening in your life. In the past 2 or 3 months, I have been so blessed to have heard like over 30 testimonies, actually, from our church network. And it's embedded into me 2 very valuable lessons, okay? The first is that God is so good at redeeming that He can take what we define as detours and use it right as shortcuts straight to Him, okay? The second is, and this is so helpful in my seasons of like exhaustion and doubt where I can't see beyond myself, the second is that God is working powerfully in places and people in ways I'm never aware of. I'm not aware of. There's a whole world of beauty and purpose beyond my suffering, and I'm actually invited to join God in that, both as a way of healing for myself and as a way for blessing to others, okay? As we're faithful in this, God can turn our suffering into a tool for beauty and goodness. I've been obsessed with this quote, and a lot of you guys, I've shown you guys already, but let's read it again. Any pain or tension that we do not transform, we will retransmit. In the face of jealousy, anger, bitterness, and hatred, we must be like water purifiers, holding the poisons and toxins inside of us and giving back only the pure water, rather than being like electrical cords that simply pass on the energy that flows through them. Next slide. The natural, instinctual temptation in the face of jealousy, anger, bitterness, and hatred is to give back in kind. You hate me, so I will hate you. But we are invited to something higher. At the very hearts of the gospel of Jesus, at its moral center, lies the invitation to go beyond, far beyond our natural instincts on this, so as to meet hatred with love, bitterness with graciousness, jealousy with affirmation, and murder with forgiveness. Beautiful. I want to share a really good real-life example of this. Two of our friends lost their newborn baby a few months ago. And in their darkest, most tragic season of their lives, as they're trying to cling on to anything that belonged to their baby, there's a family-run charity that gave a baby a warm knitted blanket. Two, actually, one for the baby and one for the parents to keep as a memory of the child. And in such a tragedy, that is the most beautiful thing ever, okay? In total darkness, in total hopelessness, that act of kindness became a light. The charity is called Parker Project, right? And their story is, 2 years ago, they went through the very same thing. Baby Parker was born a stillborn, which means that he was born dead, right? And they only had a single blanket to remember him by. And so even though it already sucked, it sucked even more because they were torn, trying to decide, do we give this to the baby or do we keep it for ourselves as a keepsake? And from their darkest season of suffering, they looked beyond themselves and started a movement where they can bless others going through the same horrendous tragedy. See, suffering doesn't have to turn you bitter or jaded. Okay, Parker Project is a beautiful example of what it looks like to look beyond our suffering and actually, through our suffering, be an agent and force of God's kindness and love. This is the thing that we are called to. Now, if you are going through the climax of your suffering, I am sorry. We are here for you. Maybe just ignore this point, okay? Keep it in the back of your head. Because that whole suffering making you self-absorbed thing, that's not wrong. That's actually functional. If I just get my leg cut off right now, and I'm like, ow, look at me, please, someone help me. That's a natural reaction. It would be hella weird if I got it cut off, and I was like, how can I invite God to this, to use it to bless other people? That is weird, okay? That's creepy even. If that is you, either write a book or go to therapy. But if you have suffered and you've processed it, or you're in the later stages of processing it, or you've been in it for 5 seasons and you kind of think you should have got over it 4 seasons ago, this is the invitation. Look outside your world. It is a huge, beautiful, God-filled world with so many other people who need Jesus, who needs you, and who you need, okay? How can you work with God to redeem the unique suffering that you've gone through in a way that blesses the world beyond you? Is it sharing the wisdom that you've learned through it? Is it warning people of your mistakes? Is it simply empathizing with others going through the same thing right now? Is it living confidently and bravely under Christ in the midst of the suffering? Is it like making a buttload of money and then donating it to that whatever particular cause, right? Give it an honest thought. How can you offer up your suffering in a way where God redeems it to help and bless the world beyond you? What could that look like? This whole talk, I'm not giving you tips on how to avoid suffering, because it's inevitable, right? Suffering will happen, okay? We're looking at truths we need to hold on to suffer in a way where we come out better after it, okay? To recap, the truths are God's presence is in the suffering, right? And we can train ourselves to deeply know this truth through practicing prayer. God's perspective gives hope to the suffering, and we can train ourselves to trust God by inflicting self-suffering, to deny yourself, to remove whatever distracts you away from Jesus. And the third one is God's purpose redeems the suffering. How can we let God work through suffering to reach the world beyond us? And as we believe this, and as we live this out, it's kind of emo, but we grasp onto suffering, okay? We welcome it. We embrace it. We let God change us through it. We let God redeem this disgusting thing in our lives, and we let him turn it into a beacon of love and beauty for everyone else to see. This is how we suffer positively. This is much easier said than done, especially when you're in the thick of it, but take heart, okay? Take heart. The best is yet to come. Let's end with this quote, and then we'll respond with the Lord's Prayer. Why is it that we want every chapter to be good when God promises only that in the last chapter he will make all the other chapters make sense?